This lecture is about the structures of the family, marriage, and kinship. So to begin, what is a family? A family is really a social unit that is centered around economic cooperation. It has an intention of reproduction, so it's a socially constructed unit in which children are reproduced, and because they are born into that recognized unit, they have certain legal rights that other children born outside of those unions do not have in many societies. A family is also recognized as a place in which people who reside together are family. Some of you may consider your roommates, if you share an apartment and you're very close with them, you may consider them members of your family. And in a sense, that's true because you usually act as a cooperative unit, as an economic unit. You might share food, you might share other responsibilities together. So it would not be incorrect, but it wouldn't be a legally binding family. A family is also a unit in which people who have sex together are recognized as having a legal right to have sex together. Until very recently, it was really not allowed for people to have sex outside of marriage. It's really only since the 60s that in the United States people began to loosen up about that kind of thing. There are lots of obligations that come with being a family, one of which is that you have a legal and ethical duty to take care of your family members, to support them, provide them with clothing, provide them with shelter. Anthropologists classify families as either nuclear or extended. The nuclear family is based on two parents and their children, whereas the extended family is multiple generations of people living together, and it can entail lots of parents, lots of children, lots of grandparents, aunts and uncles. And how those extended families are constructed varies considerably from one culture to the next. The nuclear family um, is the rarest form of family structure in the world. It's found mainly in the West, although increasingly with urbanization and industrialization in developing nations, you do see it growing in the cities. If you leave the cities in developing nations, you go into rural communities, you'll see that people live in extended family units. The nuclear family has certain benefits. For instance, the parents have complete control over how their children are going to be raised, what kind of religious practices they're going to be exposed to, um, the value systems and the ethics that they will share. Um, there's also a great connection between the parents. Children tend to be much more emotionally dependent on their parents than in extended families. Um, there's less harassment by other family members since those connections are weaker. You don't see them as often. You don't live with them. So there are lots of benefits. But there are also negatives to the nuclear family, and one of them is a sense of isolation. So when your parents are not around, you experience this sense of being lonely or alone. If a parent leaves, that sense of isolation is enhanced. So in divorced families where you only have one parent, oftentimes the children will have a real sense of emotional loss. Whereas if they grow up in an extended family, it's not as intense because they have more people around them. People who grow up in nuclear families also generally have a very poor sense of family identity. That is to say, that unless you have a parent who has a recognized lineage in which there were famous people or important people, most of us have no idea who our ancestors are. It's not until you do some genealogical research that you start to understand how you are the spear tip of many, many ancestors. Most of us cannot name all of our grandparents' first names. We can't say what our grandparents did for a living. And if you try to stretch back to the previous generation, so your great grandparents, you don't generally know who those people were. You don't know where they grew up, where they died, where they're buried, what they did for a living. So the nuclear family really stunts your sense of who you are, and that's simply because generationally you don't have people telling you about their own parents or their aunts and their uncles. You don't have as many stories to hear about. It's only on rare occasions when you get together for holidays that an older member of the family might relay some family lore to you. There's also fewer allies to help you when a conflict arises. If you grow up in a family of four and you have a fight with your sibling, you don't have additional people to help mitigate what's going on. You might have a parent who simply doesn't like you. In that case, you're under the protection of only one parent. So there are some negatives for children. Extended families are three or more generations. It's not uncommon these days with people living longer to have four generations living under the same roof. It's also common in many places to have aunts, uncles, cousins living all collectively together. It's a rich family life. It means that there's always someone to play with. There's always someone to talk to. It means that all of the real burdens on the family are shared. So if you're living in a single unit, then you share expenses, you share chores, you watch each other's children, you have a stronger sense of connection to the family. You're more aware of who you are as a family. The family as a collective is also often perceived by other members of culture in ways that make you recognize, that you belong to a greater community. So lots and lots of benefits there. Definitely a lot of In anthropology, we recognize many types of extended families. The ones that you have to know about here are patrilineal and matrilineal. We'll talk about one other type in a minute. What you're looking at here on the right are two charts in which you have circles representing women and triangles representing men. And I have them reversed here. It should have been let me see. Oops. Let me stop this for a sec. Something's not right. Well, these two diagrams are actually showing exactly the same thing, so I'll just work with what they are. In a patrilineal family, everything is organized around a man, and descent is traced through the men, and women are brought into the home, as opposed to a matrilineal extended family in which everything is organized around a woman and the men move into a woman's home. When you have these type of societies, what ends up happening is that in the case of a patrilineal family, the father is a very important figure with his children, whereas in a matrilineal family, it's the mother's brother, assuming she has one, who acts out the role of father in that society. And the biological father, actually, since he'll be somebody else's brother, he'll be the father figure to that family. Just a different way of viewing the roles that people play in society. It certainly doesn't mean that people don't love their children. In my experience, people, regardless of the family structure they have, they love their children. It's just how we are wired to love our kids. But the obligations, the legal obligations, are tied to the role that you're. There's one other form of organization. It's very common among hunter-gatherer groups, especially, and it's called a bilineal descent, and it simply means that you trace your descent from both sides. It also means that everybody is responsible for the kids. There's not a one role played by a man, depending on if he's the mother's brother, or that everybody's responsible in those. Was something that happened between heterosexual people. And that has been and continues to be the dominant form of partnership throughout the world. In most societies, it is a monogamous arrangement today, but in the past, it has been more common, I would say, in certain parts of the world to have polygynous marriages. We'll talk about that in a minute. Marriage is the legal binding of people together into formal partnership, and from that point on, together, collectively, these people have legal responsibilities to each other. In the United States, we have changed the laws in recent years so that now we have same-sex marriage. That wasn't the case until maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago, beginning with one state adopting same-sex marriage and eventually it becoming federal law that we recognize partnerships between same-sex. All marriages have rules. These rules are, it's good to understand them if you go to a place, a culture you're not familiar with. Sometimes the rules are very shocking to Americans, especially when you discover that you're in a culture where the age of marriage is very different from here. In the United States, it's not standard from state to state. Some states you can be legally married at 16. In New York State, I believe the law says you have to be 18 to be legally married. So in the West, we have this traditional form of marriage in which most rules say, it's a heterosexual union. All children born to the woman of that partnership are legitimate offspring and have legal and economic rights. Now, in other parts of the world, unlike the United States and other parts of the world, this continues to be the traditional view of monogamous marriage. Certainly if you go to Europe, most of those countries do not recognize gay marriage. I believe that will change eventually. The recognition that people should be married or allowed to get married regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, is something that we consider that we consider that to be a non-ethnocentric perspective on marriage rules. It results in happier unions for people who are not forced into heterosexual marriages if they don't, if that's not part of their identity. There are very few societies that don't have marriage, but there's one in particular that you need to know. It's the Maswa, or the Na of China. This ethnic group lives in very rural areas of China. They don't have marriage. They don't have a word for it. What they do is they accept love relationships. Because they are matrilineal, matriarchal, um what happens is that if you are attracted to someone, the man will enter into that woman's household. And yes, I say woman because I don't think I've ever heard of same-sex love arrangements in this culture. The man spends the night, and if the woman becomes pregnant, then everybody accepts the birth of that child. Um, because they live in these extended families, what happens is that men and women live together, but they're all related. So sisters and brothers live together. Um, the mother, the matriarch, rules the family. It's not that people don't know who their fathers are. They do know who their fathers are, and they do have celebrations of the birth of the child. But legally, the only persons who are responsible for raising the child and paying for all of their needs is the mother and her brother, not the biological family father. So um, nobody talks about having sex. It's really considered improper behavior. You can have lots of partners. You're not forced to be with one person. They don't talk about children as being illegitimate. There's no such language as infidelity or promiscuity. One of the things that happens with the Maswa, and you can see this by going onto YouTube and typing in Maswa, is that a lot of tourists have come out into these rural communities to see them as if they're specimens, and they have confused these people with being prostitutes. So there's a lot of conflict as a result of that. Another conflict is to adapt. Um, Among marriage rules, there are oftentimes lots of taboos, and one of them is, of course, incest. The incest taboo really tells you who you can't have sex with, and that varies considerably from one culture to the next. If you think of the Egyptian pharaohs and many royal houses throughout the world in the past, it was very common for fathers to marry their daughters, for sons for brothers and sisters to get married, and that was simply a way of retaining control or power in that community, holding on to property, making sure the kingdom wasn't divided. Um, in a lot of communities today, you can have cousins marrying cousins, but we do have these taboos here in the United States. We absolutely don't allow any closely related people to have sex together. So we don't allow mother son, father daughter, sister brother. You do hear about these cases in the news. If there are children born to those unions, they are really uh, considered to be anathema. People have all kinds of reasons for having incest taboos. One of which we talk about here in the United States all the time is just inbreeding. We know can be genetically bad. You can have deleterious genes that get reproduced, passed on from one generation to the next. The other thing is that when we have situations in which a father has been, we would say, raping his daughter, it destroys the family. It's a rupture, causes a rupture in the family. So if you have these incest taboos, what ends up happening is that you seek your partners outside of the family, and it increases your alliances in the community. Um, Many communities have arranged marriages. Um, Anthropologists have studied this quite a bit. There are some societies that have matchmakers. Other times, the parents will be trying to marry off their daughters, especially with in developing nations where you have very poor families. A daughter just represents a lot of times a loss of income. So they try to marry her off as quickly as possible. And it has resulted in a lot of child brides. So anthropologists have come down on the side of that this is something that has to end. There's a lot of videos out there that talk about that. In societies in which parents arrange the marriages of their children, um, it's not always the case that kids don't have the right to voice their opinions, but oftentimes they have very little voice in that. So there are certain rules in terms of how you get married, where you can choose your marriage partners from. In some societies, they practice what is known as exogamy, and that means that you have to select someone outside of your particular group. So, for example, if you live in a society in which you have not tribes, but you have, gosh, I'm drawing a total blank here. You belong to a group and they say you got to marry outside of that. And if you just think in terms of extended families, they may say you can't marry anybody who's as close as three related steps to each other. So, for example, in most states here in the U.S., we say we don't want you marrying anybody closer than a second cousin. In other communities, you may belong to a group that has to always choose from a specific other group. I'm drawing a blank on what it's called. Clans. All right, so you may have to pick outside of your clan. Here you have a picture of Meghan and Harry. And Harry, he is an interesting person because he has decided to practice exogamy. He was supposed to marry within his group, which is to say he should have married someone of royal background or minimally of noble background. And instead, he has crossed a lot of boundaries here. He has married someone who's not from his national. Endogamy is a marriage rule that requires you to marry within your group. The best examples of this are people who are born into caste systems. Caste systems have extremely rigid marriage rules. You cannot usually move outside of their caste. It is oftentimes an oppressive kind of arrangement. In the United States, we say that people marry within their own social class. We don't have any laws that say you can't, but in caste systems, it's almost like there's a legal basis for forcing you to marry within your caste. Go back up here. Nope, not going to see it. Oh, you can see it here in purple and in the blues. These are regions of the world in which you can marry multiple partners if you can afford them. So polygyny is where a man is allowed to have more than one wife at the same time. Um, you can't do that if you can't afford them. You have to actually be financially able to do that, because usually you have to buy your wife or you have to pay a bride price um, in those type of societies. Polyandry is where a woman has more than one husband at a time. And polyandry is often found. Well, first of all, it's not common. It's very rare, and you do find it in the husband. So not the most ideal thing for everybody in the marriage. A lot of cultures require a transfer of property. Sometimes that's from the bride's wife to the husband, his family. A lot of times it's from the husband's family to the wife's family. Sometimes it involves goods and money. Sometimes it actually requires labor of some kind. The bride service is a form of labor obligation. This is often done in hunter-gatherer communities. A man will work for an agreed upon period of time for the wife's family before he actually can exercise his marital rights. And it's actually pretty good because it allows the couple to get to know each other slowly over an extended period of time. Bride wealth is the most common form of marriage exchange, and that's usually the groom's family is giving something to the wife's family. If the marriage ends, then there has to be a return of a dowry is different. It's where the wife has to actually give something to the husband's family. It has become quite an issue in places like India and China because unfortunately if you click on this little video link down here, what you'll see is a report. All married couples have places that they choose to live. Here in the West, it's very typical for a couple to just establish their own household. But in patriarchal, patrilineal societies, it is more common for the couple to move in with the husband's family. So when you move in with a family and you're the outsider, so in this case a woman, all marriages have divorce rules. Rules of divorce vary considerably around the world. In the United States, it's a pain in the ass because most people get an attorney, and the attorney is the one who benefits the most from people. There are worse consequences for women of divorce all over the world because usually what happens is the woman ends up raising the kids. She no longer has the financial security that she had when she was married. A lot of times friends will disassociate themselves from that woman because they're unfortunately women who are married now see this woman as a potential threat to their own marriages. A lot of poverty because unfortunately the women just don't make the kind of money that their husbands do in most cases. And a lot of times there's a sense of frustration because there's no one to help with the children, especially if you're living by yourself and not in an extended family. There can be other issues like you may lose your inheritance. Your father might get remarried and transfer all the property to the new family. So a lot of problems with divorce. It's a negative in all situations, but unfortunately sometimes it's unavoidable. Other things that happen with the construction of family is that when you know who you're related to, you know if you're going to inherit property, right? So some people trace their family line through their father's side and others through their mother's side. Here in the United States, we don't privilege one or the other. Most of the time, we accept both sides of the family. But if you know who you're related to, you know then who you can ask for help from. And one of the functions of family is to help support people, make loans, allow access to things that you wouldn't have access otherwise. Those family privileges are. So how you trace your descent is. So this is just to reiterate this idea of descent. Some people, like in the United States, I think we would all agree, we practice double descent. We recognize our grandparents on both sides, although if I were to ask the class who has their father's last name, my guess is that most of you would raise your hand. Very few people have their mother's last name, and even this slide shows you a link to a TED Talk. It's called The World's Largest Family Reunion, and we are all invited. And I want you to watch this. This is important. Video. This man talks about having done his DNA and discovering all kinds of relationships